Hey everybody, it's Mr. Marshall here at Stony Lane. I'm coming to you because I heard that you and your class are going to be starting to read books called fantasy books. And so, fantasy books are some of my favorite books. And there's another video that I have that tells you all about fantasy books. But today in this video, what I want to show you is kind of like in other genres that we've talked about. There's certain things that readers think about in each part of the book, in the beginning, and the middle, and the end. And so today I want to tell you about what the work of readers is inside of fantasy books. So we're going to talk about what you should be thinking about in the beginning, in the middle, and the end of the fantasy books. Okay? Things that you should be thinking about. And sometimes in these videos, what I do is I read a book to you and I kind of show you that way. I'm not going to read you a book today because I want to be able to kind of get this information to you quickly, and you can try this out with a chapter book of your own. Some of these fantasy books are kind of long, and it's hard to watch that in a video. So here we go. So in the beginning of the book, one of the things that we want to think about, just like in lots of different books, we want to think about who are my characters and what kind of people are they? Do I like them? Right? Most stories that we read, that's an important thing to think about. We want to think about who our characters are and what do we know about them, right? Do we like them? That's true about most stories, not just fantasy. The next thing is also one of the things that we think about in most stories, right? Because in the beginning of most books, we want to try and predict, right? And so we want to think about what do I think is going to happen, right? We do that in most stories, don't we? We try to think what's going to happen, right? And there's different ways that you've learned ever since you were very young on how to do that. Okay. And the last thing is different because it's something that's very specific to fantasy. Okay. In the beginning of fantasy books, we think about what is the setting of the story and what are the rules of nature in this story. How might this affect the story, right? Because like in fantasy books, depending on where we are, there's different rules, right? There's different rules than maybe the rules we're used to where we live on this planet in this world. Okay, because in lots of fantasy books, there might be magic, right? There might be creatures that we don't really have in our real world, right? And so we want to get to know those and think, how is that going to affect the story? So that's the work that we're going to do in the beginning, in the first chunk of the book, right? So if our book is like 100 pages, this is probably like the first 30 or so. Okay? These are the kinds of things that we're going to be thinking about. So in the next part, in the middle of our book, right, this part, which is the biggest chunk of our book, if our book is about 100 pages long, then this part is probably like a good 50 pages, right? So let's think about this. So, one of the things we think about in the middle of a fantasy book that we think about in lots of different books is this: how is the relationship of the characters developing? Because characters that are in a story, they have friendships, they have relationships, and those relationships change, right? Especially when you're reading higher level chapter books. Okay, so we want to pay attention to how the relationships of our characters are growing and changing because they are. Okay, the second thing that we want to think about is very much a fantasy thing. It's very much a fantasy thing. Um, Actually, no, I'm going to tell you this next one first, which is not so much a fantasy thing, right? Because in most stories, okay, especially when you start reading chapter books, our characters start to change. So we want to think about how is my character changing, but we also want to think, well, what's causing the change, right? There's a special word that scientists use when one chemical changes to something else. The thing that causes the change is called a catalyst. A catalyst. And inside of books, there are catalysts too. And sometimes the catalyst is another character. Sometimes the catalyst is an event, something that happened, right? Sometimes in fantasy books, the catalyst is magic. Okay, so we want to think about how one character is changing and what's causing the change. We want to think about how the relationships of our characters is changing. Okay, so the next thing that we think about in the middle, right, is most fantasy books have magic. We were talking about that before. In the beginning, we were trying to think what kind of magic is there, but we want to think in the middle, what is the role of magic in the story and how is it affecting my story? Okay? The magic is doing something. It's affecting the characters or it's affecting what happens in the story. That's something that we call plot, right? And so we think about that stuff. We think about that stuff. How is magic affecting what's going on in the story? Okay? And the last thing for the middle here, I told you the middle was the biggest part. Lots of times, not all the time, but lots of times, fantasy books sort of have good and evil, right? Sometimes good and evil characters are going on, or there's good and evil magic, and that affects the story. So there's lots of things that affect the story, that affect the characters and the relationships, and sometimes that's magic, and sometimes it's good and evil. Okay, so there's a lot to think about in the middle of a fantasy book, isn't there? So now let's think about what we think about at the end. Okay, let's think about what we think about in the end, right? So the things that we think about in the end of a story are kind of like what we think about at the end of lots of stories. We think about how did my character change and what caused the change, right? So we start thinking about that in the middle and then we keep thinking about it in the end. How did my character change? What caused the change? Sometimes we can think about it like, what did my character learn, right? Um, and the last thing I'm going to put up here, also something that we think about in lots of different kinds of books. What does the author want me to learn about life? What's like the big lesson of this story, right? Even in fantasy books, there's lots of lessons. So that's the work of readers in fantasy books. Okay, think about these things. They might help you kind of enjoy your fantasy book, but also do some really deep thinking. You can write about these things. You can talk about these things with a friend. You can just think about them. Okay, it'll help you really, really get into your book. Okay, try that out. It'll be magical. I'll see you next time.